Hi, and welcome to My Words, Our Journey, the podcast. I'm Monty, your host and author. This is Season 9, Episode 3. Let's do a quick recap. Captain Sib is on his last voyage before he retires. One problem, a beautiful woman named Kit has him wrapped around her little finger, as his ship is being extorted. When we finished last episode, the captain was calling the second in command at Lintwood Investments. Let's begin Chapter 11 and see how that call goes, shall we? Chapter 11, Greg Collins. To his many friends, Greg Collins was a dependable, outgoing, funny guy. To his co-workers, he was a goof-off, with little to no drive, and a sense of humor that was not office appropriate. To Camp and his associate Greg, became a problem. 3 days before his disappearance, Greg had gone to Mr. Camp's secretary, asking for a few minutes of the man's time. It was an odd request from a low-level associate, but he stressed the meeting's importance and assured his gatekeeper that Mr. Stevens would want to hear what he had to say. 2 days before his disappearance, Greg met with the operations manager for exactly 17 minutes. It would be the most important 17 minutes of his short life. Greg was 27 years old when he vanished. There was no way for Camilla to know exactly what was said during the meeting, but she did track down an old friend that had received a call as soon as the meeting was over. According to this friend, Greg was optimistic, upbeat, and glad that he had made the decision that he had. Greg spent most of his time when he wasn't at work day trading, swing trading, and looking for that next less than a penny stock that was going to make him rich. He also was interested in the company that he worked for, so when he saw the last pump and dump, he decided he had to talk to someone. According to his friend, Greg had told Mr. Stevens his fears of security fraud, and his boss genuinely seemed appreciative that Greg had made him aware of the situation. Mr. Stevens had assured Greg he would be rewarded for his efforts. Greg, his car, and most of his personal belongings vanished. No contact with family, friends, work, no activity in his bank accounts. Just gone. Camilla had spoken with the local authorities. They had found nothing that would suggest anything other than Greg wanted to disappear and start over. That was not what her experience and that little voice in her head was telling her. So, yes, the Greg Collins angle was a partially bluff, but his name associated with the cities should push Camp into doing what was necessary. When Captain Sib heard the double click, he assumed he was being transferred. On the other end of the line, he heard an annoyed and clearly nervous Camp Stevens demand, "Who is this? What do you think you're doing?" The question went right along with what Captain had been instructed to say. "Mr. Stevens, this is Captain Sebastian Greenwald III. My ship is the Estelle. I will get right to this point. This is my last voyage, and I'd like to make it my best. Therefore, I am asking for $1.7 billion to be deposited into my account, provided to your cell phone within the next 5 minutes. This deposit will ensure the timely arrival of the Estelle to port and the records regarding your little escapades ending up at the bottom of the ocean. There is no negotiation, no need for the authorities, reporters, just a simple transaction. No excuses, you have 24 hours. You will receive the bank information as well as documentation demonstrating the seriousness of your situation. There will be no more communication with this ship until the money is moved. Do not test me." The line went dead. Captain Sib fell back into his chair. Camp Stevens poured himself a drink, told his secretary to hold his calls, at least for the next hour, maybe 2. Chapter 12, Bad News Friends. It was only 4 minutes when the first text came through. It was a good quality picture of him leaving a hotel in Dallas, Texas with Armando. Then another. Again, a picture of him walking in front of the Embassy Suites in Seattle, Washington. Then, 2 more of the same, Madrid and Sydney. The pictures were clearly taken from video cameras in the area where they were, but they were damning in the wrong hands. There was a brief pause, then another text. It was a picture of Greg Collins, a still shot taken in front of his apartment, with a man on each side of him walking towards a parked SUV. Camp knew exactly what had happened to Greg. He was made fully aware. He assumed so he would know what his fate would be if he misstepped. $1.7 billion? What is this guy, nuts? Before he could contemplate his answer, Melvin Thomas came barreling through the door. What in God's name is going on? Melvin was Camp's closest friend. They had gone to high school together, MIT for a short time, and Melvin was the first and only person he had a hand in recruiting for the company. Melvin had several degrees, but he had found his home in accounting and payroll. He had quickly risen to VP of that part of the operation with no help or impact from Camp. That was a precursor to him accepting the job in the beginning. Melvin had no idea what Camp had been up to. It would break his heart if he ever found out. Taking a seat, he slides his phone over to his best friend, Melvin to Camp. What have you gotten us into? The first picture was of his home, the second of his children in front of the yard with his wife. The final picture was of his parents holding hands as they walked in a park. When Camp laid the phone back on the desk, Melvin told him to slide one more time. Then there was a text. It would be in your family's best interest to ensure Camp meets his deadline. Camp could only stare at his best friend. He was seldom at a loss for words, but in this moment, there was none. None that would comfort Melvin, at least. So he approached this as he would any issue at the office. We have an opportunity we need to take care of. Chapter 13. Timothy. The weather had been perfect, and was expected to be the same for the remainder of the trip. Timothy and Tiffany were enjoying themselves, both professionally and personally. So far, things were going exactly as they'd planned. It all seemed so easy in the movies, but the planning, the stress, the money, they had talked about the what-ifs, but those had been suppressed. Timothy had promised Tiffany that he would try to enjoy the moments, and he was really trying. He would feel better when the notification came through to his phone that the money had hit his account. One hurdle at a time, he thought. He felt an extra burden, since this was mostly his idea, his plan for the most part. While Tiffany had helped recruit some of the players, it would fall back on him if it failed. There were so many lives depending on the outcome. Tiffany and his future would be bleak if this didn't materialize. He thought back to when this first idea came to him. Timothy was no criminal mastermind, but he did like to play the what-if game. What if you were stranded on a desert island with one movie, one album? What if you could see only one concert, and it could be anyone, ever? What if we wanted to somehow take over a cruise ship for the opportunity for generational changing money? The idea was so far-fetched, but was it? After a few minutes, he dived straight into the rabbit hole. He was not raised around guns, had no combat training or special skills that would make him think he could accomplish such a feat. With that in mind, he fell deeper into the hole. How else could you take over a ship? All those passengers, employees. Way too many to control. But what if he only needed to control a few? Okay, let's go with that. Everyone has something they would do anything for, right? Sure. Find theirs and exploit it. Threats, empty or otherwise, to loved ones, exposure to something that they had hidden. There are ways, he thought. What to do if they simply said no? Would they start with one? Who would be the most impact? Could they really do that? Could they convince others that they would, even if they wouldn't? They could certainly try. Timothy was 36 years old. He and Tiffany had met 4 years earlier. It was good, but like so many, he figured money was a cure for the few things that weren't perfect in their lives. He had grown up middle class, never really needing for anything, but wanting more. That had not changed. Tiffany and his salary set them in the middle to upper class range, but it didn't feel like that most days. He wanted more, and he knew Tiffany did as well. The freedom this money would represent, well, it'd be life-changing, for all except for that 1% that we like to hear about. Timothy was willing to risk everything for that life, that 1%er, and so were his teammates, each for their own reasons, he understood. How far would they really go? He hoped he wouldn't have to find out. The brilliance in his plan? No violence. No one gets hurt. Chapter 14. Someone gets hurt. Julie had not been doing well. Her anxiety was off the charts. She had not been able to get in touch with her boys. She had no one to speak with about what she was feeling or how this whole thing may or may not play out. Had her two boys already been hurt or taken? Would they be safe even if whatever this thing was happening was successful? Too many questions for someone that was already a worrier. Julie had a number buried in her purse. It had never been used, but it was there for a just in case. The urge to call finally outweighed the reality of not. When the young woman on the other end of the line picked up, Julie almost hung up. As she was about to remove the receiver from her ear, she heard the sweet assuring voice of Vanessa. "Hello? Is there someone there?" Julie replied, then proceeded to tell her story, the little she knew. 15 minutes later, a knock came to Camp's door. He and Melvin were discussing if they were trying to meet the demands of the assailants. When they looked up, the small frame of Vanessa Blunt came through the door in a rush. Camp and Melvin must have not hidden their confusion very well, because the first words out of the young lady's mouth were, "I know this is not normal." As concisely as she could, Vanessa told the two men what she'd been told by Julie. She had gotten a few of the small details wrong, but they got the crux of the call. Then she was gone. The two men sat in silence for a moment. The news was not good for anyone. They did not need any more people involved in this matter than they already had. The call came to his cell phone. He listened, said thank you, laid the phone on the table and put his head in his hands. One of them called the corporate office. Not an hour since the first phone call, Vanessa had been told to take the rest of the day off. She had also been instructed not to speak with anyone regarding her call with Julie. Right before she could unlock the door, she felt a presence standing behind her. The man grabbed her wrist, took her keys, applied pressure to that wrist, extreme pain up and down the arm, into the hand. The figure guided her around to the passenger's side, where he tossed her into the back seat. Another man appeared and climbed in behind the steering wheel. It was a short drive. They told her that she'd be making a call for her and her family's safety. She understood. She had met Julie once, on a tour of the ship shortly after she joined the company. Her giving Julie the business card was more of a courtesy thing, a way of saying thank you for the tour of the ship. The phone rang 3 times before it was answered. Vanessa was on point as she relayed her message as instructed. Her car would be found a week later, 3 counties over. No sign of Vanessa. She would never be seen or heard from again. Julie trusted Vanessa. There was an honesty in her voice. So when she had called and told Julie that there was someone on board that could help her, there was no reason for her not to believe it was so. The room was used as a banquet storage area. Tables, chairs, decorations, that sort of thing. It was off the service corridor. Julie had seen a couple of familiar faces as she made her way, but as she approached the door, she realized how far she was from almost everything. The hotel director was suddenly and forcefully pushed into the room from behind. There her body would stay until 4 a.m., when it would be tossed overboard. Chapter 15. Grizzly Greg. Camp waited for Melvin as he called home and told his wife he'd be working late. It was not the first time, so it was no reason for her to think twice about the call. But this time was different. Melvin had asked his friend pointedly, "What did you do that got us into this?" He was prepared for almost all the answer, and Camp's explanation had not shocked him. Then after a pause, Melvin had known him for a long time, so he knew that pause wasn't good. "You've come this far, spill it." Camp only said 2 words and rattled Melvin to his core. Grizzly Greg. He had to wait a few minutes for his friend to compose himself. As soon as Melvin had heard the name, he turned a shade of gray, stood and quickly made his way to the restroom. Camp could hear the water running. He assumed Melvin was splashing cold water on his face. The conversation was about to take a turn that he hoped the pair would be able to come back from. Greg had been with the company for a few years. He had been a good kid, eager to please management, punctual, and could have had a bright future with the company. That is why no one could really figure out why he had just left. Most of his personal belongings had been left behind, but he had taken his phone, wallet, but his pride and joy 6-year-old Lexus had been left behind. The authorities found no reason to pursue his disappearance. They chalked it up to a young man ready for a change. Happens every day, according to those that would be in the know. Greg was a loner of sorts. He had a few friends, but none that he spoke with on a regular basis. At work? Well, he worked. Not much small talk or downtime for him. His parents were certain he didn't just up and leave. For starters, they argued he didn't have the means. The little he did have was still in his bank account. Their cries of foul play fell on deaf ears, and Greg was just another statistic. You may be wondering why Grizzly. Well, good question. Greg had been given the nickname in high school when he confided in another classmate that he was obsessed with horror films. The more gruesome, the better. That news spread around quickly, and one smart teen dubbed him Grizzly Greg, and unfortunately, it stuck. Greg thought he would outrun the nickname after high school, but it followed him to college, and then to work. There were only a handful of people that knew exactly what happened to Greg, Camp being one of them. He felt confident his extortionists didn't know the details, but any suggestion implicating him would cause the authorities and his partners to come down hard. When Greg had been escorted from his apartment, he had been driven to an old but still functioning warehouse that was stored overseas shipments for one of the smaller suppliers and subsidiaries of the main company. There he had been shot in his head from behind as he pleaded for his life. Then the tarp he had been standing on was folded around him, the body taken to a field in the middle of nowhere, also owned by the company, where a large hole had already been prepared. The few that knew the truth saw no way this would come back on them. Now Camp had to make sure it stayed that way. Melvin re-entered the room, running his hands through his hair. He let out a nervous breath. Can we survive this? That's all he asked his friend. Chapter 16. An answer. The search for Julie had been exhaustive. The consensus was growing. She would not be found. That was not the first time that a guest or crew member had gotten lost. The staff were well prepared to handle the situation. The guests would not be inconvenienced or told about the issue. Most had happy endings, after all. Julie had been a mess prior to her going missing. Those that knew what was going on felt she could be a problem. Clearly, someone else had felt the same. Still, those that remained had to carry on, without question. They didn't want to have the same fate as their co-worker, but they also had others to consider. Captain Sib was going through the motions as expected, but he had neglected to check one important box off the missing persons checklist. He would not be notifying the authorities. What he had done is call all of Julie's team members together. He stressed the search would continue, but he emphasized guests were expecting a formal evening. It was called the Captain's Night, an evening when he was expected to give a speech, shake hands, kiss babies, and hug the ladies. His team assured him that they were good. The night would go off without a hitch. It would be his last captain's night, but all he could think about was the next phone call. Would Lintwood cave to the extortionists? He convinced himself 1 minute yes, and the next, no. He had seen Kit around the ship, but they hadn't spoken. He figured she knew that he had his hands full at the moment. The 24-hour clock was ticking, however, and he also knew she would find him when it was time to make the next call. There were 2 other men contemplating the call as well. Camp and Melvin had shut themselves off the better part of the morning. Both looked like they could use a good shave, shower, and a good 8 hours of rest. The pair were used to working with big numbers. They had been parts of takeovers, mergers, and buyouts over the years, money coming and going. It was a constant. But $1.7 billion? How does one move that kind of money? Camp's position within the company did not afford him access to that kind of cash, but he certainly wasn't ready to give up what he had worked so hard to build. Camp was firing questions and possible solutions when Melvin stood and began to pace. "Stop," he said. "Just for a minute, I need to think." The pension fund. We can take the money from the pension fund. Then you can run your pump and dumps until you replenish the funds. No one the wiser. And let's stop there for today. I hope you're enjoying the journey. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.